What I want to talk to you about is actually something that's very close to my heart, a project that I've actually been personally involved in for the last 3 years, which is the Land Registry environment. Anyone here working in land registries or land? No? A few? Yes? Brilliant. Of course, our friends from PSNA. So when you think of land registries, you're probably thinking about owning property. Does anybody here own property? Yeah, most of you. So there's some involvement here that you've got. But when you think of the land registry and the work that you had to go through to actually transact on a property, it's probably a little bit dated. It probably looks a little bit like that whole thing. And one of the things that we were tasked with by the land registry was to try and modernize how they operate. Because essentially, it's an industry that had not seen a lot of innovation, true innovation, since probably the 1800s when Robert Torrens decided that we should change the way that we transact property away from a deeds system, again, that's very monopoly-like, into what we see here, which is the Torrens title system in Australia. So we've modernised this and tried to take it across to something a little bit more futuristic, complete with flying cars. So if you were here last year, you may have seen Mike Bradford, who was the CEO of Landgate, and today is the CEO of Advara, which is a joint venture company that we formed out of Landgate, the West Australian land jurisdiction, and Adecco, our parent company, in order to take a platform that we've created with Landgate to market to the rest of the world. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to tell you about not what we do today so much, or not what great features that you could do on Amazon today, but actually what's changed over the last year or so, and what has been the ability to adopt changes and innovate, and how that's contrasted against potentially previous deployments of solutions and software across the public sector. Because the experience I think a lot of people have had is that change happens slowly, and change happens with big bangs, massive investments. And that was one of the key things that we wanted to get away from, was massive investments, long time to value, and big risk, because nobody likes risk. And I love the quote from Alistair McGibbon this morning when he said, "Our risk aversion is increasing our risk." We've seen that so much, and I think that in general in the industry, the quality that we see in the solutions and software that are being produced over the last 3 or so years is so much better than the quality of software that was being pumped out a decade ago or 2 decades ago. We're not seeing regressions as much. We're not seeing failures of new systems as much as what we used to. So, we started our journey with Landgate back 1,052 days ago, 13th of October 2015. It's a date that's stuck in my mind because 8 days later, my daughter was born. So I actually have a really good litmus test as to how long this has been, because her birthday comes up obviously in another couple of months. But then the next interesting date was at about 200 days after that, was when we created the production environment. And leveraging off what Aaron and Ian from Tech One said in the previous session, scripting and templating all of this meant that we created the production environment on the 22nd of June 2015 and went live on the 1st of July. And the reason for that simply was because with everything automated and templated, there was no reason to incur any cost or any overhead any earlier than that. We did it as required. Now, since then, there's been a huge change. We collect a lot of metrics. Metrics are really important. There's a saying that in God we trust, all others must bring data. And so some of the metrics that we've collected are things like time to turn around a transaction. So if you've sold a property, you're probably familiar with registering or lodging that application to transfer ownership and the time it takes for the state to recognise that transaction as being valid. And there was quite a backlog on doing that. There's in Western Australia, about 1,000 transactions a day. In New South Wales, for example, there's about 3,000 per day. And one of the metrics we wanted was, how long is it taking us? How big is that backlog? And are we meeting our requirements to actually turn that around? So over the last couple of years, this was a metric that I was given by David Downs, the former CIO of Landgate, showing how that went. And retrospectively, you can see that when we went in June, July, our ability to meet those metrics went up dramatically at the same time as a backlog on processing went down. It's not unexpected, I guess, if those two are linked. So, how did we do that? Multiple continuous improvement cycles, agile approaches to doing everything, lots of little releases. So we've all heard of agile. We've run this project now, and we continue to run it as a SaaS approach to a system which is currently used by one jurisdiction but is being adopted by a second at the moment. And we've run it on a 2-week sprint every week for the last 2.5 years, come hail or high water. And we've been improving a whole bunch of stuff. We've improved our software. And it's a pretty much classic Java application, diverged into microservices and consuming a lot of cloud-native services around it. Of course, some of the improvements we've looked at is our operational environment. What do we use of the cloud services around our applications? Some of those improvements have been from what Amazon exposes to us on their platform that we could then take advantage of. And of course, there's a whole bunch of stuff probably in the background that our cloud provider with Amazon is also improving that we don't know about. All of which is pulling us in the same direction, which is a better product and a better experience for our customer over time. So let me go back and tell you what the environment used to look like, and you can see exactly how different that looks now. So we used to have effectively a very large database and a fat application sitting on desktops written in Delphi. The actual land registry was just records in the database and a manual process for how to do those transactions. So pieces of paper being walked around a building, put on someone's desk, and then that person would examine the piece of paper. Anyone got a situation like that they're working on right now? One or two? Now, in the 1990s, there was an improvement to this. An electronic system was deployed within the agency to track where the pieces of paper were. So you could reliably say that the piece of paper you were looking on or for was locked in someone's desk. And that was the start of our thinking of, well, really the most important thing we need to do is get digital images of all of these documents that come in the door. That used to be the last thing in the workflow of the transaction processing of land titles. Now it is absolutely the first thing that happens. Everything used to be on-premise, and of course the four walls of the building was surely enough protection. It didn't need any encryption. It didn't need encryption in flight. It didn't need encryption at rest. Of course not. All of these things, which I think by today's standards, you see the ability to do things in a far better way, and there's really no argument as to why you wouldn't adopt these things. So the problems that we saw was multiple separate lines of business applications. They were all independent islands of either potentially authentication and users or concerns, and they wouldn't line up. In fact, one of the things I like to do is I like to get developers to actually go and watch what users do. Yeah? And one of the things that was observed was every user had a pad of paper beside their computer. And on that pad of paper, they would write notes of what they looked up in one application that they would Alt-tab to another application and then enter the number they'd just written down because there was no lining up of all of these different applications. You'll see this quite commonly in the airline industry, where there are different applications for booking flights versus hotels, and it's all separated out into these separate areas of concern. And it really slows users down, and it leads to errors from those users. Obviously, there was a lot of paper and manual work, as I spoke about, and a lot of human evaluation of what the permitted transactions were on a land title. Now, transacting on land titles actually comes from the legal requirements of statute. There isn't a grey area. It's either valid or it's not. There are strict rules for this kind of stuff. And obviously that was all previously transacted in wetware, humans. And what we found is actually we could get a much better accuracy, in fact, complete accuracy, by actually taking those rules and putting them into code. So, as I said, there were silly things like tracking where pieces of paper were. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive a little deeper into what that actually looks like from a deployment. It's not so much to talk about the technology, but the transition over time as to what we changed. So we started with a virtual private cloud environment, which you would have seen on the all of the deployment and descriptions about the EC2 compute environment, and effectively the two data centers that we had. Now, two data centers were linked by a dark fiber, and we established VPNs from each of our facilities for redundancy. And then we added in a single fiber direct connect. Pretty straightforward stuff. And by using BGP over that mesh of connections, it's meant that even though fibers occasionally have planned maintenance, or sometimes not so planned maintenance, courtesy of the odd farmer with a backhoe, we found that we've actually had no interruption to connectivity over this period. Things fail over, things fail back. And that's given a lot of confidence in actually connectivity over what is effectively a reasonable distance, especially from the Landgate perspective, which is in Western Australia, otherwise known as 50 milliseconds away. So let's zoom in a little bit on what that virtual private cloud environment looks like and what we've changed over time, because one of the worst things is we don't want to say this is what it looked like as best practice in 2014, because that is so different to what we have today. So in 2014, we had 2 availability zones with Amazon here in Sydney. And given that we had private connectivity to our on-premise environments, we decided that we would take our cloud-based environment and divide that into areas for different parts of our application deployment. And that was purely so that we could map that back to on-premise firewalls with ranges of addresses. This is where database servers sit. This is where application servers sit. And by the way, here are our internal load balancers that all of the internal staff are supposed to access. And so we could group things quite nicely by doing that. And over that, obviously, we laid an addressing space of some sort. Now, when you're looking at the compute environment, there's effectively a set of resources we're using. So there's a managed database environment at the back end. And we've done a technology change on the back end as well. Obviously, we've had previously an Oracle environment. We're actually using Postgres now as that. And on each of those resources, we have security groups, your basic firewalling environment. And templated totally is the relationship between all of these things. So load balancers should only talk to instances. Instances should only talk to database servers, and so on. And then there's the concept of what's outside of our virtual private network. So message queues and S3. And for those of you that already know where this is going to go, so we have a role that is assigned to each of our microservices in our environment, very specific to what one component is supposed to do. If it's supposed to do, for example, address validation and talk to our friends at PSMA, then it knows what to do with addresses. It doesn't know about transactions. And it might have the requirement to talk to message queues. And that role is what gives it the permission to talk to a specific set of message queues or a specific location in a set of buckets from S3 or other services. And that security mapping down to a very fine level is critical to what we're doing. So that initial deployment for an internal service would look something like this. We would have load balancers in one subnet, instances in another, and databases sitting effectively at the back end. And that gets repeated multiple times. And by multiple, I'm talking 40, 50 times, depending on what we're doing in our architecture and how we're changing that over time. If it was external facing, so for example, we have an interface to PEXA, the National Electronic Conveyancing Service, and we expose load balancers to them. And we can separate those out. Okay, so that's the historical view. Now let's start to go through what's happened over the last year or so. And this is the bits that you may have heard about, and you may be wondering, does that mean anything to you? Or is this something that you should look at? More importantly, what's the approach to change? So if we had an application server previously, for example, something sitting in our app server tier, it would talk over the internet to S3. That's exactly how S3 was originally designed, as I believe the second service that Amazon brought to market back in 2006. So an instance sitting in that subnet, if we wanted to avoid single points of failure, we wanted to avoid bottlenecks, we wanted to make sure that it had the least number of moving components between it and the service it was talking to, meant that those servers needed to have direct outbound access, what's called a public IP or an elastic IP, and the permission to go outbound and talk to the S3 service. Well, that changed with the availability of NAT gateway, which meant that instances no longer needed to have that public-facing IP address. Even though its security group inbound was closed, it actually didn't need to be exposed at all. And so an instance in the VPC subnet, for example, on the right-hand side, could talk directly to the NAT gateway, which would then on-forward that connection. We managed to remove a lot of public-facing infrastructure, which we couldn't do prior to the release of NAT gateway back in mid-2015 or so. Our security posture instantly improved, and some of our logs instantly got quieter because you no longer saw the internet strafing past you, trying to knock on the door, even though security groups were totally closed. The next thing we saw was the availability of endpoints, which meant private access without even having to go across the internet to talk to S3. And of course, this is something we looked at and went, that makes absolute perfect sense. And last week there was a release saying that DynamoDB also now has endpoints available. And I'm really pleased to say that on Monday that became effective in our production environment. That's about a week between general availability, all of the testing we'd done, and obviously we'd spoken to Amazon earlier about that under private beta, but that meant that got templated and deployed as a minor change through the environment, but a better security posture for our customer over time. And we're looking forward to the endpoints being expanded to cover more and more services that we consume from the cloud environment. On top of that, VPC peering got announced. So we've separated workloads into different accounts. As the guys from Tech One said in this room earlier, that they would have separate accounts. That's absolutely a brilliant idea. But however, sometimes we want those separate workloads to communicate privately. And so VPC peering has given us that ability to mesh that with a consistent networking addressing so that they can talk quietly without going over the internet. Flow logs got made available. Flow logs is the logging ability to show you what is actually happening on your network. We turned that on so we could actually see what was happening as opposed to assuming what was happening. Again, if we've got data, we've got evidence. And we flow that through into log analytics to look for exceptions. Of course, one of the other things that we looked at was a small event that happened last year. I say small, it was almost insignificant to us. And it comes from your ability to architect your workloads to make use of fault tolerance or serverless architectures. Was anyone awake on, I think it was June the 5th last year? It's a date in history. We were unfortunate enough that one of the availability zones in Sydney did actually fail. It went away for a couple of hours. But we had a 280-second incident that actually automatically resolved itself without anyone being involved. No human action was taken to restore service. It was a Sunday. I was 600 kilometres out of Perth on a farm with my family. And I checked my mail just by habit. And the first message, obviously set up from the RDS service, was database failover initiated. And the second message was database failover completed. Thank you very much. I'll get my laptop out just in case. And of course, everything had handled itself as architected, but more importantly, as already tested. And of course, if you don't test these things, you don't know that they work. The testing time is really, really important. So, after that, we looked around and went, that was brilliant. Everything worked as we needed to. But what could we do better? How can we actually not potentially have maybe the same rush on capacity that everybody else had at that time? And what we looked at was, well, there's a third availability zone that's just become available. What if we spread ourselves across 3? We're still using, at this stage, 2 instances for each of our microservices. So we've got the failover capacity, but we don't care where it gets satisfied from. And so if there was another failure to happen, then we can be satisfied from 2 remaining availability zones instead of 1, which means we've spread ourselves over a better opportunity to be satisfied at that time. So some other stuff we've taken on over time. Certificate Manager has made our life so much easier. If you're using Certificate Manager to get SSL certificates at 0 cost, there's no resistance to getting valid certificates in your non-production environments. We actually have the opportunity to make sure that everything is tied up. There are no warnings, no, we don't get certificates in the development environment excuses. Everything is lined up and perfectly working from the very bottom. So there's much less of a chance or risk of us getting the encryption piece wrong in the production environment. As I said, CloudFormation. A lot of new features have come up there. In fact, we could probably send a session just talking about the templating improvements we've had over time. We initially had to generate all of our templates by code, dynamically, to take into effect that we wanted to do variables in certain ways and link things together in a smarter way. CloudWatch dashboards and CloudWatch logs have made our life a lot easier. There are supporting services that we run around the place like Elasticsearch and other environments. Just having them log off the instance means that we're getting to a point now where direct access to compute is not needed by anyone in any of our teams, operational or support teams. They've got log aggregation services to go and look at. Redistribution of databases, the DMS service. And now we've seen new changes in that. But DMS has played a part in us in that we have lots of different data sources that we merge together, and we want to do that so that it is as loosely coupled as possible. We don't want replication being a burden on an operational environment. We want that to be as separated as possible. RDS has been a great boon to us. So anyone here using RDS? Brilliant. We've actually managed to get to a point where all of our database constructs are actually managed as code. So any index generation, any maintenance, it's all done as code to the point that we don't need a full-time database administrator looking after a database. All of the snapshots happen automatically, including going beyond that and cloning snapshots into escrow accounts. Read replicas get set up, all of the monitoring gets templated. So it's been really refreshing to get agility into that database environment and not be locked into, well, you can't make that change. That schema doesn't exist. And now more recently, the parameter store. One of the things that we do with every deployment that we look at is what accidents have happened where maybe somebody's embedded a credential into code. It's a really big no-no. Static analysis of source code has meant that we've never done that. We're not going to do that. If we do that, it's one of our gates on our CI/CD pipeline. And now parameter store means that we can simplify the way of giving a running EC2 instance the secrets that it needs. And those secrets become quite wide when you look at what would you want to operationally modify a little bit because of real-world, real-time events that are happening. Obviously, they're supporting frameworks such as SDKs and CLI updates, and obviously even Amazon Linux as a service is constantly being updated. We've got a very agile patch management approach of make sure it's patched. I think that's one of the biggest things that's come out of the cybersecurity offerings, especially since the Petya environment incidents, is make sure you have your patching up to date for everything you possibly can. So we re-baseline in a heartbeat if we have to. We apply patches on a daily basis. And right now I can say that we're running Java 1.8.141, which, unless anything's happened in the last 3 hours, is the current version of Java, because there's no reason to be on the version from 3 years ago. So let me give you a deep dive on how, if that wasn't deep enough, some of these changes have modified over time. The guys from Tech One actually gave a presentation and talked about CloudTrail, the ability to log what you are doing or what your teams are doing across accounts. And CloudTrail absolutely has been critical for us to have the confidence and transparency of every operation that's happening. So we used to have a few surprises with CloudTrail. So one of them was if a new region was launched. We always look at that and go, that's interesting. And with CloudTrail, when it was first released, we actually had to go and then turn CloudTrail on in that region. We had to go and find out the service account that CloudTrail would run as in that region to add that to an S3 bucket policy to permit it to log, because we log everything to one bucket, one place where we do our analytics from. And then for each account, we'd have to go and turn it on. So if we had 20 accounts, we'd go 20 times into new region in South America and tell it to log, please log everything. But these things have been fixed. And so our operational procedures for this has simplified down to nothing, which means there is no risk now of not finding log events in the region that got announced 3 minutes ago, or unless there's been one in the last 3 minutes. So for example, those policies we used to put into an S3 bucket to receive it has, you can see there, a bunch of account IDs that CloudTrail used to run from. In fact, it probably still does. And I would go and add another line to that every time a new region was announced or launched, as soon as I could find that data. Of course, that's changed now. It's become a service principal. I can set it once, and part of the underlying provisioning from AWS maps that to all of the accounts that CloudTrail runs from globally. No work for me to do. But I would still have to go to each region to tell it to log. Even that's gone away. So as those new regions come on, I used to go to each of them, but now there is this concept of a global trail. And the global trail just says, no matter what the region is, just log it. Follow this pattern. And so we've removed that overhead completely. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we're actively looking at right now and looking and testing to see if they're suitable to what we do. And some of these will improve our security posture. Some of them will reduce our operational overhead or our cost. So Elasticsearch, as I mentioned earlier, we've been running Elasticsearch for 3 years, and for about the last 9 months, 12 months or so, there's been a managed Elasticsearch environment. And we're evaluating that to see if that's actually something we should migrate to and not run our own stack. The EC2 environment, obviously Lambda is now available and has been for about 1.5 years or so in Australia. And we've started moving small pieces of supporting infrastructure to it, so things that we would have run from management servers as scheduled tasks or cron jobs for those that are familiar. We're now migrating those across to Lambda so that we can actually wrap a very tight security policy over what those scripts actually do. Much tighter than what, for example, a general purpose maintenance host or management server would actually have access. ELB, We currently have one per service for discovery. We're investigating whether the application load balancer would be appropriate, but at the moment with client-server two-way SSL certification, we actually need to check on how that's going to operate and what changes we would need to do in that case. Data replication. So I touched on data migration servers earlier. AWS Glue as a data pipeline, ETL pipeline, got announced, about 2 weeks ago? And now we've got a new tool in our tool bag to investigate and see if that's more appropriate or not. For our reporting, we're currently using a drop-in third-party tool which generates dashboards for us. Does everybody here love a dashboard? Yeah? It's great to be able to visualize all kinds of data, and obviously different users across the enterprise have got different requirements from those dashboards. Some people want to see those backlog statistics that I was showing earlier. Other people want to see number of messages in a message queue. Two very different groups of people, I can tell you. Now we have QuickSight available in Sydney, and as I said, data jurisdiction is actually a key thing for us, so the availability of reporting here in Sydney is a key piece for us to look at. And in the future, endpoints. And IPv6 that we may start to look at. We've got these services available there now. There's no additional cost for us to do them. It's just a change in our architecture to start to adopt them over time. So this journey is continuing, and what we're finding is that it's our ability to execute on them and adopt these changes that actually has given us such a good security posture that we're reasonably confident in. We're constantly looking to improve, and we're following the recommendations of as many possible documents, boards, and advisory panels as possible. So we've talked about NIST today. We've talked about the Cloud Security Alliance. There's a whole bunch of these things, and they've all got really good recommendations of how you would operate your environments, and we're following all of these. But we found that by taking what is effectively a SaaS mindset, software as a service mindset of this just has to be done, it's in the customer's best interest, be proactive and not reactive, we can actually achieve what the customer's intent is, which is make sure your platform works and is secured. And we're finding that it's serving us and our customers' customers even better. We've had, I think, in total just a couple of hours over 2 years worth of downtime. And most of that's been our fault, where we've looked at something and maybe not had an index on something and then had to change things around. All of which has been really low-hanging fruit to go and fix. So with that, I'm going to come to an end. I'm going to be here for a couple of hours, so if anybody wants to ask any questions, please come and see me. I've got a couple of my Agilon colleagues here as well in the second row here. And yes, if you've got questions, please come and see me. Thank you very much.